Yeah, it's 6:04. Let's get started. Well, hello, everybody. My name is Shanti Singh. I am she, her pronouns. I am the Legislative and Communications Director at Tenants Together. I'm based in San Francisco. I am mostly a pedestrian bus rider, but my husband bikes, and I occasionally try to bike. Tenants Together is a statewide organization. It's a coalition. Our headquarters is based in San Francisco, but we organize tenant unions. We counsel renters statewide on their rights. We agitate for local and state level pro renter policies, and collectively advocate for 18 million California renters in Sacramento. I'll be co-hosting this with Robin Kuttner, who is with Urban Environmentalists, who's hosting this wonderful panel. And Urban Environmentalist mission is to address the climate and inequality crisis by transforming cities and towns into inclusive communities designed around people rather than cars, which I appreciate because I don't know how to drive a car and I never learned. So just so everyone knows, Joanna went over this, but we are going to be recording this to post to our YouTube channel. If you're going to post in the Q&A, there's a Q&A function in Zoom. We will have a Q&A section for later. If you want to be anonymous, please feel free to just indicate that. We won't use your name if we don't have to, and we'll only use first names. Yeah, we don't even have to even use any names, actually, never mind. So yeah, that's just welcome. Thank you all for being here. I will say that I'm coming at this from, not only just being a San Francisco resident, a San Francisco renter, but as somebody who does statewide renter advocacy. There are a lot of intersectional issues here for tenants who bike. Renters, tenants are far more likely to be bike commuters. We tend to live in denser housing. We tend to live in more urbanized areas, not always, but a lot, disproportionately so. Tenants can be harassed by landlords for having bikes in hallways or parking them in the wrong place, inside or outside. I was struck by, I was talking to some of my colleagues, letting them know that I was gonna co-host this panel with Robin. And, someone even mentioned, our campaign director even mentioned that, she had even she lives in San Francisco and she used to run the San Francisco Tenants Union. And she mentioned that she had received a bogus eviction notice for parking her bike in the hallway. Fortunately, that didn't go anywhere, but, when she went for advice, people were like, well, nobody can do that to you. But at the same time, they were like, be careful, don't take a risk, right? So bike parking is definitely one of those issues that really disproportionately affects renters, and it is part of a renter's rights issue, especially when there really aren't specific protections for that. That's usually something that kind of happens in your lease, or you can try to put it in your lease, but luckily San Francisco has more extensive protections against the kind of evictions that people can pursue and against harassment compared to a lot of other places in California, but it's still really tough. There's obviously, like as with all issues, there's a disproportionate impact on low-income people and people of color. Like I said, there's no laws on the books specifically around bikes, and maybe there should be. But it's important, I think, that people feel like bike storage and other issues around bike safety and bike advocacy, I think, are really, really intersectional with tenant issues. Because it's part of tenants feeling empowered to actually exercise some, control or articulate what exactly it is that they need. Just because you're renting doesn't mean that you don't have rights, or that you don't have the power to actually make sure that you're negotiating for the things that you want and need. So that's kind of why that's the angle that we're taking at Tenants Together, and we're really super excited to be here. And I'm going to kick the rest of it off to Robin to introduce our panelists.
Thanks, Shanti. Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us tonight. I see lots of familiar faces and names from the San Francisco bicycling community. So, many of you probably have had a bike stolen, or were going somewhere, but were worried about where you might lock your bike, or maybe you took bike share, which cost a few extra bucks instead of taking your own bike to get somewhere because of security concerns. So you are not alone. We are all in that situation. And secure bike storage is a hot topic, not just in San Francisco, but in many otherwise bike-friendly cities around the country. And on that note, we are honored to have with us tonight Shabazz Stewart, who is actually coming at us from New York, founder of a company called Uni. We have Adrian Leong, who heads up the bike parking department at SFMTA. And we also have Brian Wiedenmeyer, executive director of the San Francisco Bicycle Coalition. So thanks to our panelists for joining us. And we are going to start with some prepared questions. Thank you to the Twitterverse for providing me with most of these. And after some of these prepared questions, we will have Q&A with you, the audience. So we're going to start with Shabazz. We've gotten a lot of questions from curious people about the actual mechanism or logistics of how Uni works. So to start us off, can you give us a little spiel, maybe photos, maybe not, of what Uni looks like, how it works?
I'll give you the spiel first, and then I can transition to some photos on my my computer's a clunker at the moment, so you have to kind of bear with me. But secure bike parking is the second or first, depending on who you ask, leading reason that people choose not to bike. It's the most significant barrier to entry, and it's one of the leading reasons that people who bike don't bike more often. Those are two different things. Question number one is people who don't bike, why don't they bike? Question number two is people who bike, they have bikes, their bikes are available to them. Why don't they choose to use their bikes to commute or to travel or to take ad hoc trips on a regular basis instead of on a episodic basis? The challenge with secure bike parking is that typically, and this is true, by the way, for everything in the bike world, we'll call it, everything in the micromobility verse, so to speak, is that we typically think about bikes as a form of recreation and amenity. And now we're slowly migrating to bicycling as a form of transportation, and planners and advocates even and policymakers and the private sector haven't fully caught up yet. So when we think about bike infrastructure and secure bike parking, Uni was an exercise to imitate how we look at public transit. Here in New York, we've got 3,000 bus shelters because it's common knowledge that if you're going to ride the bus, you don't want to get wet when it rains. You want to have some place that has a seat, and you want to have illumination. So we've got bus shelters. We've got 400 on-street newsstands because, hey, when you're walking around, do you want to get some candy? Do you want to read the news? Do you want to have like a little convenience store? We have about 1,000 city bike stations, bike share stations, because to build a scalable network of bike share, you need some density. You need station density that's relatively commonplace. We have 1,729 Lincoln YCs. Those are free Wi-Fi terminals that are citywide. And that's because Wi-Fi is considered a 21st century utility, not an amenity, a utility. But when it comes to secure bike parking, in New York here, it's virtually non-existent. In the Bay Area, it's largely limited to BART and to Muni, right, at transit hubs. We need to start thinking about bike parking like we think about bus shelters, newsstands, bike share, et cetera, and see it as a dense network on scale. I'll close by saying London has 7,500 secure bike parking facilities, secure bike parking spaces dispersed across their 32 boroughs. New York City has 20. I think San Francisco has under 1,000, and they're largely concentrated around transit networks, around transit hubs. So if we're going to think about how we get to a network, a scaled network where everyone in the city limits has access, we need to think about it on scale, dispersed, and accessible and affordable. So Uni is an exercise in doing all of those things. How do we design? How do we operate? How do we market? How do we finance these kinds of infrastructure systems? And to get there, we have to adopt an approach that's similar to transit, as opposed to, we're selling property owners some hardware, we're selling transit agencies some hardware. So it's an omnibus approach, a comprehensive approach to a problem that should have been solved a long time ago.
Awesome. Thank you for that intro. So some more kind of logistical questions that we've received. People are really curious about these things. Can Unipods accommodate cargo bikes or e-bikes, anything like that?
Let me pull up. Sorry, let me pull up our deck here, and that
Great.
way we will see. And just bear with me 1 second. We will see just a few. Okay. Can I share my screen?
I think so.
So Uni, we've got 3 form factors. This is in front of you, a mid-density form factor. This is a rendering. I'm going to actually hop around a little bit. We've got a low density form factor, which is designed for the curb. And this is in production right now. We're working on the prototype. It's going to be delivered in August. Going back to the mid-density form factor, these can park cargo bikes in a vertical format. We do have an assisted lift rack that we're piloting now that enables heavier e-bikes, even cargo bikes, to be lifted in a mechanism that's not doesn't involve user support. When it comes to the Uni mini kiosks that are on the curb, we're not there yet on cargo bikes. We're working locally with advocates to think about how we can adopt and port over a model that can park cargo bikes. The challenge with a curbside format is that you're limited by a parking space, and cargo bikes are quite long. So, to park a cargo bike effectively on the curb, you're going to have to either diagonal it, or you're going to have to, put it adjacent to the street in a manner that isn't really conducive to density. We have a high density form factor that's called Uni Hub that's inside buildings, and there cargo bikes would be pretty easy to accommodate. I would say that, exit the screen share. I will say that the challenge logistically in integrating high quality public space bike parking infrastructure is multifold, right? Like, you've got to think about what kind of bikes, what kind of people are going to use the system, how are you going to enable not just something that's going to work well on day one, but how are you going to enable an automated system to perform at a high capacity on an ongoing basis. Cargo bikes, I think, are probably the bike parking universe the most significant challenge in terms of accessibility and accommodation, because they're not standardized. Road bikes, e-bikes, even those thick e-bikes with mountain bike tires that are like, fat tires, those are relatively easy to accommodate because they're under 40 pounds. They're relatively standardized. Cargo bikes are just extra long, and so it's a challenge, but it can be done. It just requires a little bit more real estate, and real estate's a precious commodity in a city like San Francisco, for sure.
Definitely. So, thinking about the curbside, the mini pods, is the intent to have hypothetically shared access among households? What does security and access look like?
That's a great question. It's going to differ by installation. Uni was designed to two things. One, Uni was designed to be a system. So our interest is in a public system that's accessible by the public to the public at large. We don't really have an interest in creating private bike parking for buildings or private bike parking for institutions. In those cases, property owners can just build them on their own. One of the challenges we have here in New York is that it's actually required, if you're building a new building, even as of right, you have to build secure bike parking into your building per the zoning code. So new developments have secure bike parking, but the vast majority, like 95% of New Yorkers, live in buildings that are not that are pre-bikes and buildings. That's our local legislation that forces developers to build secure bike parking. So building it in the public right of way as a system, as a municipal system with a municipal contract, is really for everybody. It's really open access. That being said, when you look at the bike hangar model in London, which I think is the closest thing worldwide to a scalable secure bike parking system, in a residential area, you may have people that are parking close to a one-to-one basis, because people in in their homes, they tend to park overnight. They tend to leave the latency period is a little bit longer. In a commercial area, let's say we're on Market Street, or let's say we're at Civic Center, you're going to have much higher turnover, much lower latency. It's a destination. People are going to be parking their bikes for shorter periods of time. They're going to be pulling them out relatively quicker. Here in New York, we have a third group of people that are what we call working cyclists. We have 80,000 working cyclists, mostly immigrants, mostly people of color, who park their bikes actually at destinations as well, and in high density areas overnight. And so our job is to account for residents, commuters, people who are taking episodic trips, and also working cyclists. Each location you put an asset in is going to have a different use case scenario. So it really depends, and I'm sorry to be long-winded, but it really depends on the use case, on the placement, on the size, exactly where that particular asset's going to go. You can think about it as a public transit network. A subway system is going to have many different types of use cases: people going to work, people going for recreation, people going to have a good time, people taking short trips. A good public transit system is versatile and can accommodate all of those things.
Thank you. And I think you transitioned that quite nicely with some of these topics about, new developments requiring bike parking and just the different use cases in terms of a transportation system. I'd like to transition to some prepared questions for Adrian now, who's with the San Francisco Municipal Transportation Agency. So last week, it was Friday, right, was San Francisco's Bike to Wherever Day, formerly known as Bike to Work Day. And Mayor Breed announced that San Francisco is starting a secure bike parking pilot program. Can you tell us a little more about this?
I can. I actually remember exactly the context that kind of what we call long-term secure bike storage parking came up. And it was, I think, Alex Sweet, who is the mayor's one of the both related to SF Bike Coalition, but also on the mayor's staff. She was heading to like a doctor's appointment, and she had a cargo bike, an electric cargo bike, and she's like, "Where do I park this so that I feel like it's okay?" And she was like, "Nowhere. I can't." There, like, all of a sudden I can't get anywhere. And it wasn't a home storage issue, but it was that similar vulnerability that I think affects so many bicyclists, right? I always say that, like, and I think Brian's heard me say this before, but I think like biking is practice and vulnerability in a good way. Most of the time, like, you're interacting with the public, you're exposed, like, you're kind of like in life, but in a scary way, in a bad way, right? Like in terms of like biking safety, or like worried that your thing is not going to be, your device, your mechanical legs fundamentally are not secure or aren't dependable, right? And it makes sense. I really appreciate Shabaz's stats, kind of like this, why do people not bike, so it's a real barrier. And then, so Alex reached out and she said, "Hey, what are y'all thinking about long-term bike parking?" And so we kind of refreshed this conversation that's been going along inside MTA for a long time. And so, just to give some context, we've always had, bike lockers and bike valets at different places. A lot of them are privately run at Caltrain, but also at Giant Stadium and now at Chase Center. And now we have Caltrain bike lockers at the 22nd Street Station. But getting long-term bike storage is a complicated process for a lot of different reasons, which I'm happy to go into. The pilot that was, I think, referenced came out of this discussion, and it's actually, we're looking at this possible partnership with Uni to say, hey, where can we put two of these in some dense neighborhoods? I think we're looking at like Soma area to start with, because there's it's being we've done so many bike improvements there, and this idea of recovery and having more people bike, it goes hand in hand with that. So that's kind of where we're targeting those pilots.
Great. And do you have maybe a more personal long-term vision for what secure bike parking could look like in San Francisco? Like thinking about curb space, and we currently have parking available, it's just not for people on bikes. What's your dream?
Oh my gosh, there's this topic is like really profound in so many ways related to biking, and also, you know, what Shanti was saying about equity at the beginning. A major challenge and something that I'm very envious of London about with their bike hanger program is repurposing of the public space. And almost everything I do when I became a planner, you know, especially at the MTA, it's this discussion: what do we do with the public realm? And I think for bike advocates, it's like, well, we should be definitely providing more space so that bicyclists can feel safe and secure, you know, for when they ride. And for bike parking, that means how do we provide more facilities? And I love that the first thing Shabazz said was real estate is a premium. In places where real estate is a premium, it gets really complicated. And you know, whenever we do a bike project, even my other program that I manage, bike share, you know, the only real trade-off is parking spaces, right? And I now I'm flashing to these emails Robin sent me that's like, how do we advance this discussion to not this actual panel, but like the general discussion in San Francisco to parking, not just for, you know, metal machines like these, like car storage. How do we advance it to say, hey, this is actually something that we can use? And I was talking to somebody else today, and they were reminding me of those parking day. Do you remember those parking day celebrations? We used to do those all the time. And it's really kind of waned because it became almost passé, like, yeah, we could do something else cool with these spaces. And it's interesting now we have these shared spaces, but you know, it's actually an awesome time because we're starting to say, oh, we should, like, commerce is okay in these parking spaces. We can use these we can give these park spaces to businesses and they can make more money off of them. That's good. But are we at the part where we can say, hey, we should actually put secure bike storage in here? And I think that's a harder discussion for people, and it gets back to this whole: are we a bike city? Are we not a bike city? And I think that's a big discussion that is larger, right? Because the moment that you say, oh, let's try a bike hanger here, there's people that say, who's using this? This isn't for me. I don't have a bike. How come they get to do that? And it also dovetails with the vaccine lottery idea, right? Because the way we think of parking right now, it's a lottery system. It's like whoever wins the lottery, when that other car is leaving, then you get it there, right? And we have to get away from that sort of the equality of misery that is the lottery system of free parking, right? So having these and saying like, okay, we're actually going to dedicate this space to bike parking. I think building that movement and saying, hey, bike storage is something that everybody needs and it makes all of our lives better is something that we need to be definitely be pushing more. I know MTA uses this program that has, like, you know, if you have somebody that needs like wheelchair access, then they will actually, you know, consider putting a blue zone in front of your residence. There's no reason to say that, hey, we can get, you know, a bunch of people in a household that say, hey, we want to use our driveway space or our in front of, you know, we vote for using this curb in front of our place for a bike pod. You know, that makes a lot of sense to me. At the same time, I do want to, you know, I think the UNI program is run on, Shabazz, correct me if I'm wrong, but people sign up for an app and then you like log into the app, and the app means you can access it'll you know, access any bike pod, right? So it's kind of an app-based type system. So all of a sudden, you know, there's
we do also mail key cards to people. I mean, here in New York, only 90% of people have smartphones, so 10%, 1 out of 10 don't. And you know, your smartphone might die. We prefer to be app-based, but we also have about 20% of our users are key card first.
Use like an RFID, right? Like, yeah. So that makes that, yeah, like a tap card type of thing. So yeah, it's awesome. So just keep in mind, you know, these systems are still, I think that it's like nice to have this idea of like, oh, it's, you know, somebody can, it logs who you are and that's more secure. But if enough people have secure access to, if enough people have access to these bike hangers, it's not a guarantee at the same time that, like, you know, something can't be taken off your bike, or, you know, you don't know. The hope is that, you know, these are people, like, I want to believe in the altruism and the positivity that we all have. But remember, like I said before, biking is a practice in vulnerability, and part of that is being exposed. And so that's why I say that this topic is so fascinating, because it reaches all these different levels. When I became a bicyclist, you know, I came up through the community bike shops, and I was like like the bike kitchen in San Francisco type of thing, and you're getting these donated bikes, and you're fixing different people's bikes, but you're also repairing these like old junker bikes, and there's no, when you have one of these older bikes, the demand is different, right? So it's like there's always going to be people who are like, oh, I'm going to get that, and there's other people that are like, okay, how do I make this so that people don't want what I have, right? So there's two sides of the same thing, and I think that it's useful to think about this holistically, not to discount that, secure bike storage is also a tenants' rights issue. I think that that's important, but remember that like the things you like, other people like that. That's like this deeper Zen Buddhist type of approach. I think that is important for us to think about, especially in an anti-capitalist context. A larger, global dynamics. Sorry.
I will say, Adrian. I mean, I think that's a great point, and I thank you for making it. Like, I think part of the challenge that we have in this particular space is that for so long we've just said, we'll just put some bike parking here. But when we think about what it has to operate like as a system, having 5 bike parking spaces is very different from having 7,500 spread across a metropolitan area. What does it have to look like to have those 7,500? How does it operate? So for us, for example, yes, in New York, between 20 and 10% of people are actually on flip phones, right? They don't have smartphones, right? We've got people who don't have bank accounts, right? How do we build an inclusive experience? We actually insure all the bikes inside our kiosk up to $2,500, the depreciated value. And we have to, we had our first theft last year, our first and only theft last year. And because someone gamed the system, and they signed up with a fake ID, and they went in and they stole a $6,000 bike, right? And so, $2,500 wasn't enough for that particular person. It was better than if they had their bike stolen on the street, but it taught us a few things. And now we've got to really have a system to, we find personally that if you verify who people are, they're not likely to commit illicit acts once they're in the system. So we now have a verification process that we have to go through on social media or with holding your ID next to your face when you sign up. And that's something that, when we created the program, we didn't actually think would be part of what we're doing. But now we're like Airbnb, where you've got to really verify your identity. And because no one wants to be recorded, as we have cameras inside, no one wants to be recorded as a bike thief. And so all of those ancillary facets are really important to building a system that actually serves the public in a meaningful way.
Yeah, I was just going to chime in and say I was super excited by what you both said, Tupaz and Adrian, especially like as far as the equity lens goes, because I mean, aside from Tenants Together, I sit on a very obscure city commission, but we did a gig labor study. And you mentioned too, Shabazz, specifically that there are a lot of bike workers who are disproportionately immigrants and people of color in New York, but that's not that different from San Francisco, because our survey found that up to about half of gig workers who are mostly driving cars in San Francisco, first of all, their wages are basically negative because of the car depreciation costs and other stuff that is being factored into. Obviously, that's adding to congestion, but something on the order of like half of respondents at least basically said, if I had the funds to invest in an e-bike, if I had, if I felt safer on the street, if I felt that my e-bike was more secure, so those 3 reasons, I would switch from a car to an e-bike. And that wouldn't just have, it doesn't excuse the inequities of the gig economy, they should just be paid more, but it would actually have a positive effect on at least what people's take-home pay is. And I think people seem to recognize that, but it would also have a positive effect on, the way that the gig and delivery economy especially like affects cars and congestion in San Francisco. So it's not just an issue in New York, it is really a structural issue here. And like, this is definitely like a key part of it. And that's absolutely part of what, equity means. So I'm really glad you
I will say that here in New York, we're fighting, Uni is in one hand a private enterprise, but we're all basically public servants who are trying to figure out our own way to create infrastructure, to create public transit. One of the big challenges we have locally is the perception of cyclists as white males, white men bike, tech bros bike. But here in New York, it's actually a majority people of color, a majority immigrants. And you look at the data, the League of American Bicyclists had a really excellent report on equity a few years ago that actually found that immigrants and working class folk were more likely to bike than their peers. So when you talk to people who are in the gig economy, people who are delivering for restaurants, they don't just, for them, a bike is a form of economic mobility. It's a form of remittances payments to their families abroad. It's a way to feed their kids. So when they lose that bike, when someone steals that bike, it's an issue of life and death. We had only a few months ago a young man in Francisco Villanova who was killed for his e-bike. They shot him in Manhattan for his e-bike. He didn't want to give it up. He was basically so desperate because to maintain that livelihood. We have users in Uni who've had 7 e-bikes stolen. And each time an e-bike stolen, it's a $3,000 repayment, and then they've got to be out of work for up to a month. So if you have 7, that's 7 months of lost wages. And it's really built a constituency locally for better bike facilities, bike parking. Our Uni hub that's being built in partnership with the developer through the ULURP process, which is basically a zoning process, zoning exception process, is going to be 30% reserved by request of the community board and local city council member for working cyclists.
Shabazz, thank you for sharing kind of those stories of livelihood and building momentum. And Adrian used the phrase building the movement around secure bike storage. I wanted to toss it over to Brian now. So tell us a little bit about what is the San Francisco Bicycle Coalition's history kind of on the topic of secure bike parking, and in your tenure with the organization, have you observed any cultural shift here in San Francisco?
Thanks, Robin, and just a huge thank you to Tenants Together and Urban Environmentalists for hosting this panel discussion on this great topic, and to my esteemed co-panelists. I'm big fans of both of you, so thank you for joining me. And it's a pleasure to talk about one of my favorite topics as I have just a few weeks left in this role before I move on, and reflecting really back on the history of the San Francisco Bicycle Coalition. For those who don't know our work, we are a membership-based organization working here in San Francisco to promote the bicycle for everyday transportation. And you too can join to become a member at sfbike.org. I'm going to get my membership pitch in. But we have a long history of working towards secure bike parking, including launching what really was the nation's first nonprofit runs attended valet bicycle parking program over 25 years ago. And now that we are returning to in-person activity, you can find us at I was going to say AT&T Park, but it's Oracle Park now, where the San Francisco Giants play, Chase Center Arena, instrumental in getting attended bike parking facilities and storage areas built in both of those facilities, but also at events around San Francisco. And a couple of key policy changes that we helped enact included in 1999, the ordinance that mandates that large street festivals or outdoor festivals of 2,000 or more attendees must provide secure attended bike parking. And some of the planning code changes to San Francisco Planning Code that are similar to New York City that Shabazz mentioned, that we really fought for, and one that require secure bike parking rooms to be constructed at a certain ratio in both residential and commercial new construction. But of course, existing buildings are not included in that ordinance. So it really does only pertain to new construction. And so getting back to the equity issue, folks that live in SROs, folks that live in older buildings around San Francisco, this is a huge issue where there may not be indoor secure bike parking already. When it comes to kind of, thinking about bike parking that's publicly available, not attended, we certainly fought for it and helped establish the bike stations at both Caltrain and BART stations. So that transit bike nexus for first mile, last mile trips. And then the bike link locker system, which has been here in San Francisco and around the Bay Area for some time now. Again, as Shabazz mentioned, there's, I think you're right, about 1,000 spaces here in San Francisco that have those lockers. They are almost exclusively, I believe, at transit stations and within city-owned municipal parking garages. And BikeLink is great. One of the barriers that I will name is that you do have to, you not only have to pay for it, but you have to use a card that is a card that's mailed to you. And so, that cost barrier is there, and it's something we're thinking about as opposed to just a regular sidewalk rack where it is a public amenity, it's free, you can roll up, lock your bike to the sidewalk rack, and hope it's still there when you get back. Although a sidewalk rack is better than, of course, locking your bike to a parking meter, a post, a tree. Sometimes people do all sorts of things when there is a lack of available bike parking on our sidewalks and in our streets. I think one other thing I'll just mention, and I think we'll be talking a little bit more about this. I think our recent work around bike parking, it's important because we know here in San Francisco, actually, we've done surveys and public opinion polls. Either a lack of secure parking or a fear of theft, or actually being the victim of bicycle theft, is the #2 reason more people don't ride their bicycle in San Francisco, second only to road safety and a fear of physical safety when biking on our streets. So just like protected bike lanes and car-free spaces are part of our bicycle infrastructure, secure biking is also a component of that infrastructure and helps us really in thinking about a network of facilities that encourage more people to bike and do so safely. Very recently, I think we've been pushing the city to get more aggressive, and Adrian knows all about this, in installing those municipal racks. So moving a bit away from secure bike parking facilities or pods, but really thinking about the municipal bike sidewalk racks as not only places for you to lock up your personal bike, but as hubs and storage for shared micromobility. So bike share and scooters. So dockless e-bikes, and dockless e-scooters. And I will never forget, just thinking back, and Adrian maybe had some of these similar conversations, kind of in early discussions with micromobility providers, especially scooter companies, when they were trying to, and thinking about launching in San Francisco, when I first asked questions about, oh, your scooters are gonna have locking mechanisms, right? You're gonna be able to lock into something. And the scooter companies kind of laughed at me and were like, that's silly, why would we need that? And I was like, oh, your scooters are gonna disappear so fast, you have no idea. And I think folks figured out pretty quickly that in order for shared micromobility to work in San Francisco, you needed something to lock it to, and the humble yet sturdy sidewalk bike rack is a perfect solution for that.
Yeah, and I like bringing micromobility into the mix here. Some neighbors on my block used to park bay wheels bikes to, I think there's like a utility wire out there. And it wasn't until Adrian helped me and my neighbors, and I'm looking out the window at the bike rack, that he got installed for us. So it absolutely is important for viability. And Brian, we got an interesting question kind of on the nexus of micromobility. So somebody asked, to what degree do micromobility and secure bike parking obviate each other? Some folks are hesitant to buy e-bikes due to concern about theft or damage when parking outside. This is a frequent use case for bay wheels and kick scooters, et cetera. So would increasing micromobility access, which could include reducing prices, take some pressure off of the need to invest in secure bike parking?
I don't think so, and I don't see them necessarily as competing, needs or demands on our infrastructure. I really do see them as complementary, and I think it's important to think about the barriers that exist for people using both. One of the reasons I'm so proud of the work the San Francisco Bicycle Coalition did to fight for low-income household membership programs, both for our regional bike share system, Bay Wheels, and for the shared scooter pilot and the shared scooter program that SFMTA administers, is to ensure that that barrier of cost for those who cannot afford an annual membership or even a one-use ride, there are lower rates available. So, but having said that, if you don't know about that program and you don't know it exists, cost is still a barrier when it comes to using shared micromobility and those services as they exist right now in San Francisco. So if you're somebody who owns your own bike, whether you use that bike as a commute, whether it is, you are a working cyclist and you're using your bike or your e-bike to make deliveries or do gig work or whatever else you're using it for. One of our bike commuters of the year is a massage therapist who bikes his massage table around San Francisco. There's all sorts of ways to consider yourself, I think, a working cyclist. There certainly will always be a need for the storage and secure parking of your personal bicycle. So I don't think one obviates the other. I think they complement each other, and the more resources and options we can provide people that encourage them to choose biking, the better.
That's a
I wanna
great
add,
answer.
and
Go ahead. I was
just
just
add a
about
couple.
to.
I want to add to what Brian said. First, one of the great myths of the pervasive myths of today's transportation landscape is that micromobility and personally owned mobility are somehow at odds with each other. It's like thinking about Uber competing with Ford. I mean, and no one thinks of it that way. No one says, "Oh, I'm not going to get a car because I'm going to use Uber," right? They complement each other. In New York, 50% of City Bike members have their own private bikes, and they go back and forth and use both. 90% of all bike trips in New York are on personally owned mobility. And so I think that it's something that, if there is more access to micromobility, you're likely going to see more demand for personally owned micromobility, because if anything, micromobility, shared micromobility is a gateway. It's an on-ramp to the personal experience. Number two, some of the biggest fans of secure bike parking are micromobility companies. The biggest threat to the bottom line of the shared micromobility business model is the fact the assets don't last very long. They get thrown in the river, they get run over by cars, they get vandalized. And so the ability to have a protected place to leave a shared scooter or shared bike that's dockless is actually quite crucial to keeping these kinds of offerings sustainable and in the black going forward. So if anything, the rising tide will necessitate the need for additional secure micromobility accommodations at scale in cities across the country. Excuse me.
I think that this conversation has really veered into some existential questions that I wrestle with every day, specifically for work. Because I run the bike share program, and I also handle a lot of the policy side for scooter share, and also the bike parking program for MTA. And so, first of all, for micromobility, I think Shabazz is absolutely right. It's a huge gateway, and the fact that we have e-bikes in MTA for San Francisco, it was hilarious when they started putting pricing on the e-bikes, because people were kind of sending us notes. They were like, "You know what? I'm just going to buy my own e-bike," and I'm just going to go back to riding my bike. And I thought, oh, mission accomplished. Like that great, but also, there's other benefits to shared mobility, right? Like not having to worry about storage or maintenance or theft. The challenge, I think, in micromobility, and I really do like that this question has gravitated towards this cost side, because nobody's really talked about that yet. The micromobility, like people that provide micromobility operators, they're all losing money. There's no money in transportation unless you own a bridge or a ferry. Like that's traditionally understood. Like it is really hard to capture the value in transportation, and so all those companies are losing tons of money, and the hope is that the value that they get out of it isn't from the pricing, it's from either your data or your app usage or something like connected to auxiliary to the system. So I think that's important specifically for Unipod. Shabazz, please jump in if you want, if I speak out of turn. But there's two possible business models that I remember talking about, because there's a service provided, and it can be sustainable either by user fees or by sponsorship, right? And that could be something like advertising, right? And so putting these in a place like Soma, that's a place where, like New York, people are used to kind of seeing billboards, right? But we actually have legislation in San Francisco that says no more advertising anywhere allowed. And that's it's great, because like when you go to a neighborhood, you aren't assaulted by a lot of corporate ads and such. And Bikeshare has had a really hard time just figuring that out even. I remember when we were putting bike share stations not near, a block away from the Painted Ladies, people were like, "You're gonna ruin the Painted Ladies," and we're like, we're just trying to like get people here so they can see it. Yes, it has a panel, a map panel with like an Alaska Airlines possibly on it, but you know, it's not like in the photo frame or anything. And people are like, you've destroyed it, you know. And I know we have a penchant for hyperbole in the city, but there is a lot of pushback, and I think that's something to think about as we move forward, because it's not like the Uni service is just going to be completely free. There's going to be another trade-off cost.
No, and I think so. Two things on that. You know, when we started this particular journey, the biggest issue that we had to tackle wholesale was, how do you provide the capital to build out a scaled new form of public infrastructure? You know, I didn't get into this work to build 10, I want to build thousands. And that requires millions of dollars in capital. Charging user fees not only is not useful to the public, you're talking to someone who thinks public transit should be free, but it's also not an interesting business. So good luck selling that to investors. The way that we see Uni being paid for, there are actually three potential ways. One is systemic advertising and sponsorship. That's very different from local advertising and sponsorship. So for example, if I've got 7,500 secure bike parking spaces in San Francisco, can the locations in downtown, can the locations in commercially viable areas generate revenue through sponsorship and advertising? And can they subsidize or pay for locations in areas that are not interesting from a sponsorship and advertising perspective? So that's systemic advertising. The system can balance out through the right contract term, through the advertising and sponsorship in key areas, and you can get to a systemic, you can get to a balance sheet that makes some sense. But secondly, I think our vision is pairing this infrastructure with an e-commerce marketplace that provides services to the pod. So if you park your bike in a facility, can you get on your phone and have a local bike shop come repair your bike while it's parked there? Can you rent or buy a bike on our platform? Can you sell your bike on our platform? We view micromobility and personally owned micromobility as a massive, massive market. That's also the fastest growing market in transportation today. And we think that providing a utility that everyone needs is an entryway into that market. And so the benefit of that secondary form of revenue is that it can actually pay for advanced deployments, even if there is no advertising in some parts of town. Thirdly, property owner subsidies. California has interesting sort of carbon capture. I'm probably messing up the terminology here, but carbon offsets programs that could provide capital for high quality infrastructure. That's an opportunity as well. But I think you're absolutely right. You know, nothing is free. Certainly in a capitalist paradigm, if I'm seeking capital from folks, it has to make sense. They're not looking for 1x, they're looking for 5, 10, 20, 30x in return over a period of time. But I don't think there is any value in nickeling and diming cyclists. The market just isn't there. Porting over a car parking model to bike parking, there's just no appetite for that. So it's got to be nominal or free in order for it to be viable to the public and viable as a value proposition.
Thanks for sharing some of those economic considerations. That's super interesting. I do want to switch over to, we have had a lot of questions submitted and we're gonna try to get through them. So thanks to everyone who's been participating over in the chat window. Just gonna go through a few, and maybe the panelist who wants to speak up can do so, feel free. So in a previous Urban Environmentalist panel, we discussed the politics of curb space in residential areas. It can be quite contentious. How has Uni demonstrated the importance of on-street bike parking to the no one bikes, we need these car parking spaces crowd in a residential area?
I'll keep this really short. Part of the work is advocacy. We're not, who matters? So one of the problems these micromobility companies faced was that they were largely just white guys from the suburbs who were coming into cities and weren't prepared to engage in a serious community discussion. We go into communities and we say, hey, here's the trade-offs, here's the value you're gonna get, here's how we're gonna pay for it, and here's who's gonna serve, and we actually listen to them and integrate concerns into our structures. We were told in New York, which is notoriously difficult to get things built in, that we would have to watch out for the scary community boards. We have community boards writing letters to City Hall demanding uni expansions and saying they're okay with the advertising because they understand the value proposition. Look, I'm an old-fashioned progressive. I think that if you treat people like people and communities like communities, then you're able to get results that are actually effective. And if you come in and you antagonize communities and you say, I'm going to do this without consulting you, lo and behold, then you get results that speak to that.
Absolutely. So on a related note, and maybe this question is for Adrian or Brian, what are some of the alliances that have been made to try to convince San Francisco neighborhoods to give up car spaces for bike infrastructure in general, not necessarily just secure bike parking? And have you come across any surprising reasons why certain partners did end up supporting bike infrastructure?
I'll go quickly, and I just to segue from the previous topic about how do you convince residents or folks to give up curb space for something. I think the decision to pilot this program in Soma is a smart decision, not only because of the potential use, but it's a smart political decision. And that's because residents and property owners and folks that live and work in this neighborhood in Soma, where I live, where I am right now, tend to have a little bit less of this feeling of entitlement and ownership when it comes to the curb space in near or adjacent to where they live or work. That being said, I think this is the work of the San Francisco Bicycle Coalition. It's what we do every day. It's about organizing. It's about showing up in community consistently, finding your champions, identifying them, and giving them the information they need to speak up when they need to speak up. And it's also, I think this is also gets to if I had some kind of parting thoughts about doing this work now for 7 years and organizing and advocating, this is why we need to be intersectional in our advocacy. We need to be showing up for other causes consistently and talking about, a range of issues from affordability, immigration, and we haven't talked about policing, and I think that's an important topic I would love to cover at some point in this. And kind of I want to own, and I have been owning both, on a personal level and as an organization, I think the harm we have caused in the past, in years past, by involving the San Francisco Police Department and relying on policing as a solution to bicycle theft. And the harm that has caused Black and brown individuals and communities, and the harm that needs to be repaired and the trust that needs to be rebuilt because of that advocacy in the past. So, when folks in this space who care about biking and care about bike advocacy, I steal a quote from my friend Tamika Butler all the time, which is that bicycle advocates and this community is full of folks who have experienced depression for the very first time when they got on a bicycle. And it shows up in how they show up in public meetings and in public spaces. And it's just like, why don't you care about theft or, 3 feet for passing? And it's like, well, if this is the most important issue and you're kind of flummoxed by why other folks in your community, your neighborhood are not maybe responding as vehemently or can't see your point of view, there's work that needs to be done at both a professional and a personal and a community level about, what privilege looks like, what white supremacy in this movement and in this city and in our communities looks like. And then I think specifically, that gets back to this, then the particular conversation about curb space. When you're coming to make the case for either, a protected bike facility that's going to take away parking, a bike parking pod that's going to take away parking, how are you showing up as somebody who is not the other, a white 20-something from the suburbs or from a tech company saying, I've got this great thing to sell you, and why can't you see the value and the benefit of it? No, I've showed up before for your, the issues that we've been working on and talking about that are important to your community. Maybe now, I have a better chance of being heard and being listened to when I want to talk about this issue that's important to me, but may not be something that impacts your life in a daily way.
That was a really great answer with potentially a lot to unpack. I feel like we could have a whole separate panel discussion on some of those intersections. But on the note of kind of benefits for city groups, and police could be considered part of that, secure bike storage helps get police out of potentially harmful enforcement. Have there been strategies to show benefits for a city or for police departments? Is there any strategy to try to build those bridges there to support implementation of secure bike parking?
You mean like, has the MTA partnered with the PD to be like, how much of your time is spent on bike theft?
I don't know if I'd use the word partnered, but kind of making the case for, for separating these things, which probably don't need to be intertwined.
There's been very little partnership with PD about that. I mean, the most partnership with PD right now is through the Vision Zero effort, and that's very much about safety and is not even accessing, and I think that there's this sort of Vision Zero hole that has kind of been dug a little bit, that we really entrench ourselves in this focus on safety, which is very important. But mode shift is also part of safety, and creating the built environment that supports that is also part of safety. And also, when you talk about modality, I mean, there's a whole movement in transportation equity that's why, instead of focusing on mobility, focus instead of modality. So I want to bridge from Brian's answer to Shabaz's, because Shabazz talked about how like mobility companies are largely like this feeling of a suburban like white techie coming in and being like, hey, guess what? You can share all these devices together. And I think Brian's answer is great, because it's like, yeah, part of the challenge of micromobility is that it's not intersectional at all. It's this focus on supply of the device, right? So I love this kind of theme that both of them touched upon, and I can't see MTA closely working with PD specifically for kind of resource data sharing, like the questions about like how much resources are you spending on that. But I'm not sure we need to, right? Like there's all these other things that we need to do. For me, in terms of this question about curriculum management, I think there's this academic study, this smaller academic field called borderland studies, and it's about focusing really on these like, where political borders are, right? And kind of the interchange across borders. I actually think of the curb management as that borderland space now between the vehicle realm and the pedestrian realm. And it's this like very interesting human place where people stop being drivers or bicyclists or scooter riders or whatever and become pedestrians in this very human space. And so I think as we think about, I think the discussion of curb management has this really amazing opportunity for us to really humanize mobility as, this thing that everybody has to do for all these different reasons in different ways, and is also inheriting all these other contexts of historical injustice and disparity which we have to make up for now. And so the more we start complicating that conversation and seeing it for that is really useful. So
I will just say that before we close, here in New York, we can't get police to tell us how many bikes are stolen citywide, period. They don't even track that. So I don't think we have anything to worry about in pitching to secure bike parking to the police department, because I don't think they even understand the problem exists and is a serious one. It's the greatest, most ignored problem in the transportation landscape. You talk to policymakers, transportation planners about secure bike parking and bike theft. They give you a blank stare. In New York City, according to Transportation Alternatives and DOT, 1 out of every 4 households has experienced at least one bike theft. I'll leave you with that.
Yeah, I will say in terms of the SFPD, any kind of bike-related SFPD incidents I've seen are probably not ones that anyone here in this group would find productive or reasonable. But it is 7:02, so we're gonna close out. This is super fascinating. We could have done this for several hours. I just wanted to say quickly, and I'll kick it back to Robin. As far as like Tenants Together is concerned, thank you also, Brian, for sharing the SF LAFCO study of gig workers. And there's more detailed questions about what what gig workers responded to, particularly with, with e-bikes, affordability and safety issues. So definitely check that out. But as far as Tenants Together is concerned as well, I would actually just say I don't have a specific event to plug. Follow us on Twitter. We do have, if you are experiencing as a renter particular issues with storing your bike in or out right around your building, that is one of the many issues we tackle. We have open tenant clinics. If you want to organize, we have tenant organizing clinics. We've got a whole bunch of stuff going on. So I would just say follow us on Facebook or Twitter at Tenants Together. Robin, take it away.
Thanks, Shanti, and thanks to everyone who participated. And there were some super interesting and intriguing questions. We hope to see you at the next Urban Environmentalists event, which will take place on June 7th, where we will meet State Assembly District 18, that's in East Bay, candidate Janani Ramachandran, and also hear from Jess McBride about the campaign for fair housing elements. Shabazz has put his contact info in the chat, and Tenants Together's contact info, and the Urban Environmentalist website. So please sign up and follow, and you will not miss a beat. Thanks so much for giving us your Thursday evening. Hope to see you riding around.